and, and this is how we're starting today. So imagine a video with students painting and helping and talking about how great Jesus is, and there's a picture of a mountain and some rainbows, because that's relevant, and talking about that in any ways. So like I said, my name is Luke Bear. I'm the youth coordinator here, and part of that job is every summer I get to, and I do mean get to, go with students on a week-long trip. We've been doing this for the past 4 years in partnership with an organization called YouthWorks, which is an incredible organization that has mission trips all across America and in some of its territories. I know for a fact they have one in Puerto Rico. And one of the reasons we love partnering up with YouthWorks is because YouthWorks works with community partners for these mission trips. So we show up and we are partnered with organizations that are already active in their community. So we know that our work isn't going to waste. It's the same, like we're partnering with organizations that we here at Lutheran Church of the Cross partner with, like Caring Hands, Freedom for Youth, Riverside, these kind of organizations that are present in our community doing good work. And so we know when we show up, what we're doing is helping out members of the community instead of just showing up and doing our own thing, repainting a house that's been painted 9 times. And it's always an incredible opportunity. And I'm going to be honest with you, every time we come back, I get the pleasure to talk about the mission trip in a message. And normally I really rely on something going terribly wrong and talking about how that was, God showed up and it grew us. But I'm going to be really honest, this trip was really smooth, really incredible. God really blessed us. Things went really well, and students really felt the power of the Holy Spirit as they served the community in Denver, Colorado 2 weeks ago. It was incredible. So the sermon today is going to be a little interesting because I don't have my go-to way of doing it. So we're going to tell some stories from the trip and talk about this big question. For me, as the youth director, as much as these trips are a great opportunity to serve, it's also a time where I have these students for a week where they're away from their normal setting, where they're a little more maybe interested in learning about God, a little more engaged. And so for me, I'm always like, what can we do to help our students grow their faith? And this year, as we were preparing for this trip, something I really wanted the kids to learn was how God shows up in other people, how God shows up when we serve one another, how God shows up when we engage with service. Because for me, one of the places I've always found God is in the people who've served me and the people I've served. And so night 1 on this trip, the way our days kind of go is you get up in the morning, you serve all day from 9 to 3 p.m. You get some showers in like a community center. You get an outing. That's where we get to go see the mountains and stuff like that. And then they have a worship service, and then my favorite time, which is church group time, which is where just me, our leaders, and our students get some time to kind of debrief our day, to talk about what God may be doing in our service time. And so on our very first service night, I posed to the kids this question, which is, where do you see God? And I posed it with this idea that I'm like, well, in people, because that's where I see God. But as we discussed this throughout the week, I was impressed by how many ways our God has revealed himself to these students, their families, and our community. And so, to kind of set this up, we're going to dive into Acts 1, because this sermon series called Go and Be the Church is out of the book of Acts. Acts is the sequel to the Gospel of Luke, and so Acts 1 begins with the ascension of Jesus. Luke ends with the ascension of Jesus. Acts begins with the ascension of Jesus. And so I really love this story because it's all about looking for God. So the story goes, after Jesus had risen from the dead and spent some time among his disciples, he took them up to a mountain to give them their final commands. And the disciples are really concerned with whether or not the kingdom of Israel is going to be restored at this time. They ask him, is now the time, Lord, that you're going to restore the kingdom to Israel? And so they're in their heads thinking, is now the time that all these grand dreams we had about political authority, about power, about being in charge of the nations again. Is that going to happen now? And Jesus says, I don't know when that's going to happen. Now's not the time. Instead, I want you to go back to Jerusalem, wait for the Holy Spirit, and then I want you to be my witnesses here in Jerusalem, in Judea, in Samaria, and to the ends of the earth, right? And so he sets them on mission instead of that. And then he does the wildest thing. He floats up into the clouds. And they're standing there looking up. And it says he goes up, and he goes up so far they can't see him anymore. And I imagine the amount of time pass that it begins to get a little awkward. They're just standing there looking. And we have to be fair here. Like, I find this humorous, but we have to be fair. If you saw somebody float into the clouds, you would be a little perplexed. You would be a little interested in what's going on. Maybe they're imagining he's just going up there to get something, and then he's going to come back down and restore the kingdom of Israel because they think it's time. And so they're up there looking, up at the clouds. And so then, I imagine Jesus being like, okay, you've looked long enough. There are two people in white that appear. And they say to the men of Galilee, why do you stand here looking at the clouds? Jesus will return the same way he went. Go back to the city of Jerusalem. Wait upon his Holy Spirit so that you can be on mission, right? And so they do. And then the rest of the book of Acts happens because of that. And the reason this story to me is so important when we're asking the question, where can we find God, is because I think we have this impulse as human beings, as Christians, to stare up into the clouds, motionless, looking for God, like thinking that he's hiding somewhere up there from us, right? And I mean this sometimes literally. Some people literally are like, God's up there, and that's where I have to find him. But also like in the sense that we can get really, for lack of better terms, navel-gazing. We can get really introspective, caught up in like, if I just know enough, if I just think enough, if I just pray enough, if I just read my Bible enough, that's where God's going to reveal himself. And sometimes he does. But we put it on ourselves to find God. And if this week, 2 weeks ago, if that week revealed anything to me, it's that God is constantly revealing himself. And so I'm going to tell kind of 3 little ways that this week God revealed himself. Some are new to me. Some are the ones that I've always looked to, and some I think are dependable and always relevant to our life. So I'm going to start with the first one. So on that first night, I asked the question to the students, where do you see God? And students started sharing, there were some really like typical answers, like, oh, and when I read my Bible, I really feel like God's there. And they're right. God shows up in his word, right? God shows up in sermons, right? That's where other kids said that they found it. They said they found God in worship music, on all these powerful spiritual things. But one that really struck me is a student told me about his routine, where after work he would drive down this road in the country that aligns just with the sunset. And he'd go out and he'd stop and he'd read his Bible. And he said, that's where I find God. And it made me think, because for me, right, I'm kind of, I have an agenda. I want to teach these kids something. I'm thinking, I want you guys to see you can find God in people too. But for me, that was a new way of thinking about where God may show up. And I started thinking about the teachings of Jesus. Because Jesus really had this way of looking at the world around him and using it to teach about who God was and using it to understand who God was. And I'll give you a couple examples of this, but it's all over Jesus' teachings, especially in Matthew, right? When Jesus is teaching us not to worry, he tells his followers to look at the birds, right, up in the sky. They don't worry about the food for tomorrow. They don't store it up. They don't hoard it in barns. No, they don't worry about it. And so, if God cares so much for those birds, how much more must he care for each and every single one of you, his children? And then he says, look at the lilies in the fields. Look how beautiful they are. He says they're more beautiful than Solomon on his best dressed day. They're gorgeous. And they don't toil and spin or worry about where their clothing will come from. And if God cares so much for the lilies, how much more will he care for you? Do you see how Jesus looks at God's creation and sees in it God's very nature of provision, of care? He also uses this to teach about loving your enemies. Jesus says to love your enemies like your Father in heaven, who causes the rain to come on both the righteous and the unrighteous, and causes the sun to rise on both the righteous and the unrighteous. That God provides no matter what people's character are. And so that when you love just those who love yourself, that's easy. That's what everyone does, even the tax collectors, Jesus says. But when you love those who hate you, you are embodying the way your Father in heaven loves all of his creation. And so Jesus looks at the rising of the sun, the coming of the clouds, and he sees God's love for everyone. And he tells all sorts of farming metaphors. He talks about animals. Like, this is one of the ways Jesus connected with God. One of the ways he taught us to connect with God. And for me, this was a new way of thinking about God, because I'm really in my books, and I'm a really, humanistic person. So I'm like, okay, we read it, and we see it in other people, and it's like, oh, perhaps out there in nature, in God's creation, God reveals himself. And it's funny, so on Wednesday, as I'm thinking, this happened on the first day, a Monday, as I'm thinking about this throughout the week, on Wednesday we go up to Lookout Mountain, which, to give you some context, I'm not a well-traveled person. I flew for the first time last year, and I've flown 3 times since. Too many times. Man's for the land. I don't like flying. But, so I've not seen mountains a lot. And so we go up there, and I'm already kind of just impressed by oh, wow, we're really high up. And I'm driving up the mountain, and the kids are having all sorts of fun. Every time I took a corner, they would scream, and they'd scream just a little too long, and it'd get less funny, and then they'd scream a little longer, and it'd get funny again. And so I'm cracking up. It's the second year in a row I've driven a van up a mountain, so we're not going anywhere with mountains next year, I've decided. But so we get up there, and it's this great experience. The kids get tons of pictures. But as we're up there, it's raining, and you can see it across the valley, this rain coming down, and it's beautiful. And so the rain's coming our way, and we pack up, and we leave, and we start heading down the mountain back to our site so we can have church group time. And as we come down the mountain, because of the rain, there's a rainbow over the mountains across from us. And we have this moment where it's like, oh, wow, that's really incredible. And I'm reminded that the rainbow itself is God speaking to us through nature, right? In Genesis, after God floods the earth, this image of decreation, of creating a fresh slate, of starting over, God says to Noah, I'm putting my bow up in the sky, right? And one of the ways you can interpret this is God puts his bow, his war bow, up in the sky. I'm declaring peace on humanity. That from here on out, my methods will be about redemption and peace. And so this rainbow itself, that apparently everyone in my family was here last night, and there's a rainbow, and they all texted me about it. Apparently there was one last night. But that this is a reminder, I was in my basement, this is a reminder of God's care for us, God's promise not to turn his hand against us. And so even in nature, God reveals himself to us. The second way, and this is the way that I've always felt God revealed, that we saw during this trip, is in other people. And so the bulk of this trip, really, they keep you busy from dawn till dusk. And most of that time you're spent at work sites helping in the community. And so students were doing all sorts of things. We helped at thrift shops, helping them get organized that were charities. We helped at food banks. I saw the most impressive food bank I've ever seen in terms of organization there. We helped serve food. We helped organize food. But we also worked on a lot of homes projects where people's homes need renovation or something, and they don't have the money or they're too old to be able to do that on their own. And so one of those projects is through an organization that is focused on painting houses for people who are on a fixed income and can't do that themselves. And so on my last 2 days, we got to paint a house at this woman's house. And as we got there, this woman was really, really kind. You could tell in a sense that she really craved connection with other people. And we were there to paint her house because one of this organization's goals is that painting someone's house helps connect them to their community. Because, it's not fun always to be the person on the house whose paint is chipping off, or the person on the block whose paint is chipping off, while everyone's other houses are all nice. And so part of their goals is connection with community. And so we're painting this house, and it's a bit hectic, it's a bit busy, and I see we're missing 2 of our 4 students. And I'm like, where are, because I'm responsible, we should find these students. Where are these 2 students? And someone tells me, oh, they're inside playing guitar for this woman. And I go inside and look, and this woman is sitting there while one of our students is playing guitar, and she's just enthralled. She's so happy that somebody is finally playing this guitar. She had won it in a contest, apparently, and it just sat, and she never learned how to play it. And she was just enthralled because the student was taking the time to be with her and was giving her more service than I think any of the painting could have done. And I remember thinking, because, I can get really goal-oriented of like, oh, they should come help paint. But at the same time, I was reminded, like, no, what this woman craves more than her house being painted is connection. And it reminded me of this story about Jesus, because I think so often we get caught up in doing a project and accomplishing a goal that we miss the human beings that we're serving. We think there's not enough time to accomplish our goal and care for those around us. And this is one of my favorite stories from the Bible. It happens, Jesus arrives in the town by boat, and coming up to him is the religious leader of the town, a man named Jairus. And Jairus tells Jesus, my daughter is sick, she's dying, will you come heal her? And of course, Jesus is like, yeah, of course. And they start running through the town to get to his daughter in time before she dies. And as they're running, at the same time, there's a woman who for 12 years had been bleeding. And this would have left her a little abandoned by the town because, and this is something I like to remind people, like it's unclean to touch blood, right? Both in ancient days and today. Sometimes we look down at ancient people for being like weird about blood, but you shouldn't touch blood today, just FYI. So in that day, she would have felt very abandoned by her community, very separate because of her condition. And so she thinks to herself, there's this great, powerful healer. If I can just touch the hem of his robe, maybe I'll be healed. And so as they're running through town, she reaches out in the crowd and touches the hem of his robe. And Jesus stops the crowd and says, somebody's touched me. And one of his disciples says to him, Lord, teacher, we're in a crowd of people. Everyone's touching you. We don't know who it is. And he's like, no, I felt power come off of me. Which is just a weird, moment in the Bible, because it's like, okay, that's an interesting way that Jesus experiences his own miracles. And so he stops the crowd and wants to find this woman. And so eventually she comes forward, they find her, and he says to her, daughter, your faith has healed you. And it's this moment where Jesus takes the time because he realized, yes, this woman has been healed. Like the thing she wanted is accomplished, but another thing she needed, which was human connection. He calls her daughter. He invites her home. He recognizes her. He sees her, maybe in a way she hadn't been seen in a really long time. And interestingly, at this moment, a servant comes from Jairus' house and says, Jairus, don't bother the teacher anymore. Your daughter is dead. And so you think, oh, just like how often we get caught up, ooh, we wasted our time with this, and so we failed in our mission. But for Jesus, there's enough time for the mission and for people. And so he says, no, let's go. She's not dead. She's just sleeping. And they show up and they say, teacher, she's dead. Don't bother us. Don't come in. He says, no, she's just sleeping. And he comes in and he says to the child, daughter, wake up. And she does. He raises her from the dead. And the story is evidence of how God is capable is generous, is abundant, that there's enough time and resources both to accomplish our goals, to paint the house, and to care for those around us. And in fact, both are very important to God. And so learning to trust in that abundance of something that to us can feel so fleeting, like time, like energy, like effort, is one of the ways in which God reveals himself. By showing me that there was enough time for these two students to spend time with this woman who was lonely, and enough time for us to paint the house. Because we painted the house. We were done by noon the next day. Totally fine. And I think this is extra important because Jesus is not silent about the kind of people he's going to appear in. In the book of Matthew, when Jesus gives his end times prophecy, he talks about on the day of judgment, he will sort people into goats and lambs on his left and on his right. And he'll turn to the lambs and he'll say, I tell you the truth, when you saw me hungry, you fed me. When you saw me sick, you visited me. When you saw me in prison, you visited me. You cared for me. When I was naked, you gave me your shirt, right? And the lambs will say back to him, Lord, when did we do any of those things for you? And he'll say, I tell you the truth. Whatever you've done for the least of these, you've also done for me. Jesus is very clear that he shows up in all people in need, that his suffering is shared, that our suffering is shared with him as he goes to the cross, that none of us are alone in our suffering. And so if you want to find God, one of the places you can do that is in service to other humans, to the people who are in need, and even yourself when you're in need. You can trust that God is with you then. This kind of brings me to my last place that I feel that in this week God was revealed. If you've been to one of these messages before about the mission trip, I always tend to talk about this ritual we do at the end. They at YouthWorks always facilitate a foot washing at the end of the service week, where the leaders of the program wash the feet of the leaders of the churches, who then wash the feet of their students. And I'll tell you what, the first time I was going to one of these, I was a younger man, and I was like, gross, I don't want to do that. Children's feet, not, teenage boys' feet. Not great. Also just weird. It feels weird, I was always pretty strict about my boundaries about I'm an adult and students are students. But I remember thinking, okay, our Lord did this. I think I can suck it up and do it for the sake of ritual. And I was so impressed at how every year students find a way to really connect with God through this. That through the story of Jesus washing the feet of his disciples, and through their participating in that story, that they feel the freedom that must have felt like for the disciples. And I'll tell the story here just to make it a little clearer what I'm talking about. On the night Jesus was betrayed, he was having dinner with his disciples, a dinner they've had a million times before, not a million times, they were in their 30s, plenty of times before, Passover dinner. It was like a holiday dinner, like Christmas dinner. And after dinner, he got up from the table and he took his shirt off and put it around his waist. And he got down on his hands and knees and started to wash the feet of his disciples, washing away all the dirt and grime that their lives had collected as they traveled with him. And he gets to Peter, and Peter says, no, you're the guy, you're the Messiah. That's who I believe you are. I should be washing your feet. And Jesus says to Peter, no, if things are going to be complete, if my Father's will is going to be done, then I need to wash your feet. And so Peter says, wash my whole body. And Jesus is like, no, you don't need a bath. We'll just do the feet. Which there's a metaphor in that too, but we're not talking about that right now. But it's this really holy moment where God reveals his nature. I think in our minds so often we have God set up, like we have a feudal imagination of the world. And what I mean by that is like God's a king, and then he's got his angels, and there's humans that are adults, and then there's humans that are children, and then it goes down to the animals and whatever. There's this hierarchy. But I don't think that's the way God imagines his creation as we see in the embodiment of Jesus Christ. Right? Paul says in Philippians 2, right, that Jesus takes on the nature of a slave. that he becomes a servant. In fact, so far he goes to the cross, right? The lowest position any society can hold, right? An executed criminal. And so, like when Jesus washes the feet of his disciples, he reveals himself to them. He says, I am here to serve the world. And he gets to the end and he stands up, and this lives in my heart. Because Jesus, if you read the Bible, Jesus isn't very often very clear about who he thinks he is. He'll call himself the Son of Man. He'll do a miracle and say, don't tell anyone about it. Or even the story of Jairus, he's like, oh no, the kid's just sleeping, even though she was dead, and he raised her from the dead, right? There's this way in which Jesus is never very clear about who he is to people. And so the disciples are often asked, who am I? But here at the end, in the Gospel of John, Jesus stands up and he says, you call me teacher, and you call me Lord, and you're right, for that's who I am. But remember, no servant is greater than his master, and no messenger is greater than the one who sends the message. And so if I have washed your feet, you now must wash each other's feet, right? Jesus sends them on mission, not to make him happy, but out of the fact that if I serve you, if the God of the universe gets down on his hands and knees and washes your feet and you're made clean and new, now your whole life must be about caring for those around you. It's the only outcome. It's the only outcome from that. And so we embodied this moment with our students as we got down on our hands and knees and we washed their feet, and we prayed over each of them, and we thanked God for each of them. And the reaction every year, but especially this year, is so powerful. I had students come to me and tell me, I felt it in a way I never felt it before, right? And I want to be very clear, I don't think that's because God wasn't as present as he ever is in this moment, but there was something about this moment in which God revealed himself, in which these people said, oh my gosh, I believed, but now I see. And maybe you've experienced moments like that, right? Because I think most of the time we kind of sit in this plane where it's I believe and I really feel it, but there's those other moments where it's oh no, God is here in the room. In a sense that may have always been true, but in a sense where I've really connected with it. I was talking to my wife about this because she always advises me on these because I have bad handwriting and need help. And I was talking to her about this, about why is it in moments like this where we go away to Denver that it seems that people see God more clearly. I think some of it is just getting out of your comfort zone. There can be a pretty practical explanation of okay, we're in a new space, that's difficult, it's challenging, it helps you grow. But I also think there's this reality that when prompted to look for God, to participate in the life of Jesus through service, through care, through being cared for, there's a way in which we see it that we don't always. There's a way in which we're connected that we don't always notice. And so I hope, just through telling these stories, that as you go forward through this week, you maybe take the intention to see it. That God is at work in our lives, in our world, in our community. And I want to take this back to the story at the beginning as the disciples are stuck staring up at the sky. There's this sense in which they might think that God's hiding from them up there. But the God who reveals himself in the Bible, the God who reveals himself in his creation, the God who reveals himself in our lives and in our participation in his life, is not hiding from you. He's not trying to be a secret. He's not trying to avoid you. No, he is ever present in our very lives and accessible to you. I'm going to pray, and in a minute here we're going to have communion. My wife's going to have to bring me my script because I don't know how to do it. So I'm going to pray. In a minute here we're going to have communion. And I always want to remind people that as we have this meal, that God promises to show up in it. That right here in front of your very eyes, God is present in the meal. So present that you can take him into your very body. He's not hiding from you. He's right there for you. So let's pray. Dear God, thank you so